Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Giampiero Nacci. I'm Deputy Director for Energy Efficiency and Climate Change at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD. And on behalf of the EBRD, Cogen Europe, and GENCOM, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session about hydrogen and the role of hydrogen in fueling Europe energy revolution. This is a session within the EU Sustainable Energy Week, which is back for its 15th edition with the theme Beyond the Crisis, Clean Energy for Green Recovery and Growth. Before starting, I would like to thank the European Commission Executive Agency for SMEs and the Directorate General for Energy for organizing every year the biggest European conference dedicated to renewable energy and efficient energy use in Europe. The BRD, we have an established practice in these areas, and we're very happy to share, together with our partner, Cogen Europe and GENCOM, our experience in this space. Before starting, I would like to thank the effort being made by colleagues at the European Commission and EBRD to organize this event, and especially in consideration of transforming the event into a digital session. I'd like maybe quickly to explain a bit the structure of the event and the main objectives. We're going to have an introductory video recording from Mrs. Mairead McGuinness, which is first Vice President of the European Parliament. Then we're going to have two presentations from colleagues from the EBRD and from Hydrogen Europe to set the scene and provide the context for the discussion. Then we're going to have a panel discussion with high-level representatives from the industry, Alix Chambries, Vice President of Wiesmann, Karl de Marais, Vice President of ArcelorMittal Group, and Cosmo Panzacchi, Vice President of Business Unit Hydrogen in SNAM. Afterwards, we're going to have a session with the GENCOM colleagues, Paul McCormack and Dr. Rory Monaghan. And finally, we'll try to wrap up the conversation and provide conclusive remarks. Just briefly on the key objectives. I think we have three main topics we want to cover with our high-level panelists that can cover the whole spectrum, all the value chain of hydrogen, from supply to demand, from policy to finance. I think in the first place we want to explore and discuss about the status of play in the sector in the context of the COVID crisis, and to what extent hydrogen can play a role in supporting the post-crisis and the recovery, particularly in connections to economic growth and job creation. Then I think we would like to explore and discuss with all of you how to develop business opportunities, what are the commercial solutions to deliver hydrogen to the market, considering all the economic, financial, policy, and technical constraints and barriers. And finally, we would like to discuss the role of partnerships, how to bring together different actors to address together these barriers, and at the same time, improve confidence for investors and financiers, and accelerate the development of the hydrogen infrastructure. Before starting, I would like to give a couple of technical remarks. First of all, I would like to remind everybody that this is a video stream session, and also we would like to keep it as interactive as possible, so you are able to, all the participants are able to raise questions through Slido. Please, when you raise a question, identify yourself. We'd like to make sure that we have an affiliation to any question which is made. And finally, all this session will last for 90 minutes. So we have a lot of ground to cover. So I would go immediately to the first item. I would like to start the video recording again from Mrs. Mairead McGuinness, first Vice President of the European Parliament, which will provide an overview about the EU work on the recovery beyond the crisis. Thank you.
Well, hello to everyone taking part in this important webinar, and despite the restrictions of COVID-19, it is good that we can meet, exchange views and learn from one another. My name is Mairead McGuinness. I'm first Vice President of the European Parliament, and I'm really pleased about the title of EU Sustainable Energy Week, Beyond Crisis, Clean Energy for Green Recovery and Growth. I'm also a member of the Parliament's Environment Committee, where climate change is front and centre of everything that we do. So the European Union wants to lead on tackling climate change and has set a very ambitious target of achieving climate neutrality by 2050. And indeed, all member states are hoping to achieve that target individually as well as collectively at EU level. The production and use of energy accounts for 75% of EU greenhouse gas emissions. So it's very clear that our power sector, our energy production and use needs to become more sustainable and based on renewables and the phasing out of fossil fuel use. My work on climate law is as the EPP Shadow Rapporteur, and we're hoping to enshrine in legislation that target of climate neutrality by 2050 by the end of this year. And while 2050 seems very far away, in fact, it is just around the corner. We're all aware of the investment that's required. Even if you look at the European Union's target for 2030, the Commission estimate that an investment of over 260 billion would be required to achieve the 2030 target. And we know that that will require both public and private investments. It's very clear that the pandemic has had a serious impact on all our economies, and it makes it more difficult perhaps to look at achieving climate neutrality. But I'm very pleased that the European Union's proposals for both the next budget, but more importantly for the EU Recovery Next Generation Fund, is looking at putting in place a very significant amount of money to enable our economies to recover and to target the money in a way which addresses the climate neutrality target. That debate is going on now between member states about the size of the recovery package, how it will be financed, how it will be repaid. But it's very clear that the European Union needs a strong stimulus. It needs it now in order to recover our economies, and we need to make sure that the money available both in the budget and in the recovery package is targeted at climate-friendly policies, boosts growth, boosts jobs in this sector of our economies. And then there is this important role for hydrogen, because all of us have known that the debate about hydrogen and its role in energy production has been going on for some time. And again, it's important that this coming weeks in July, we expect the European Commission to come forward with a draft hydrogen strategy, setting out how hydrogen will help to cut energy emissions when it comes to greenhouse gases. But more importantly, I hope that today's event stimulates strong debate and puts hydrogen as one of the key drivers of tackling carbon emissions in the energy sector. And we know that it's not just energy that needs to be decarbonised. All sectors of our economy are working towards achieving climate neutrality by 2050. And I hope that the conversations and conclusions of this event will get us there more rapidly, more effectively, and create this fairer, more sustainable Europe that we all really hope for. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. McGuinness. I think it's a very interesting and compelling case for hydrogen in the context of the decarbonization in the EU and in the context of the transformation in the energy systems. Maybe let's continue with defining a bit the context and providing the background for the conversation going forward during this session. So I would like to ask my colleague at the EBRD, Christian Carraretto, Associate Director in the Energy Efficiency Climate Change team, to give a bit of an overview and the outlook for demand for hydrogen in the context of the objectives of the Paris Alignment. Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giampiero. I hope all participants today agree that it is a very exciting historical moment for those of you working in the hydrogen industry, because there are new projects announced nearly every week, despite the challenging times we're living, across all segments of the supply chain, across the entire world. And we have more and more governments that are featuring more and more predominantly the role of hydrogen in their energy and climate strategies. Just 2 weeks ago, we learned about the ambitious targets that Germany has set for its domestic production and international cooperation on hydrogen. A few months ago, other member states of Europe did the same, announcing interesting and challenging national strategies for hydrogen. And these days, we are looking forward to read about the details of the European hydrogen strategy, learning about the targets and the instruments that the EU are thinking about to use to develop the hydrogen economy on the back of the European Green Deal. So it's it's perfect timing, and we see things moving extremely fast, and actually faster than I would have expected just a few years ago. So to set the scene, I would just like to draw your attention to a slide, which I hope our technicians can share on the screen, about the current and possible future demand of hydrogen around the world. Today, we use around 80 million tons of hydrogen. Hydrogen is not new. Hydrogen is not a new fuel, and it's not a new industrial feedstock. We use it, we transport it, and we produce it with nearly all the technology routes that are available. Of course, most of it these days is gray hydrogen coming from natural gas and other fossil fuels. But we already have some supply of the so-called blue hydrogen, where the carbon is removed with carbon capture. There are some alternatives to carbon capture that are at demonstration phase, I would argue. And although it's still a niche, we also already have supply of green hydrogen in connection with renewable electricity. So, in my opinion, looking at a world that is trying to achieve an early peak in greenhouse gases to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, the challenge for hydrogen is not, or at least it's not necessarily only innovation and R&D. To me, the challenge is to scale up capacity quickly, to sustain investment, and to have a continuous pressure from the policy perspective to increase the supply chains. Because a number of different sources, including the Energy Transition Commission, which I used for this slide, forecast an increase in demand for hydrogen of at least 10 times in the next 30 years to provide a decarbonized fuel and feedstock for different industrial segments, for transport, shipping, aviation, to some extent even long-distance heavy-duty road transport, and buildings. And I should praise openly today not only Carl, who's joining this event, but ArcelorMittal, who announced today their ambition to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050, including by using hydrogen in their steelmaking businesses. And as far as we in Europe are concerned, it looks like that we have a potential of covering at least a quarter of our total energy demand by 2050 with hydrogen. And this will probably absorb some 10% of the total global production, which incidentally is kind of the same share we are having today in the natural gas markets. So I think I just have one simple question for all of us, for the speakers and panelists. How do we make it happen? How do we grow the production of clean hydrogen? How do we control carbon so that the blue hydrogen is really blue? And equally importantly, how do we ensure that green hydrogen does not compete with or delay the decarbonization of the electricity sector? We have people in the panel today that manage gas infrastructure. So the question here is, how do we future-proof our fuel supply chains of today so that they can deliver hydrogen and other decarbonized fuels tomorrow? And we have people coming from the industry and technologies. So my question here is, how do we grow quickly the demand for clean hydrogen? Is it just a matter of switching price and everything will just happen based on market laws? Or do we also need some more targeted policy and regulatory pressure to stimulate the demand side to react faster? And so at the end of the day, what is happening first? Is it the supply of cheap, clean hydrogen or the demand for this fuel of the future? So without taking further time, I would like to pass back the floor to Giampiero, and hopefully the discussion today will help us address at least some of these key, easy questions that I put on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Very useful. A lot of material on the table to discuss. I would add also to your question I think also would be interesting to understand the transition role of gray hydrogen here. What can we do to develop the market, and what is the role of the existing technologies to create this market? Thank you very much. I would like now to give the floor to Yorgo Chatzimarkakis, who is the Secretary General of Hydrogen Europe. I'm very looking forward to hear from you, Yorgo, because you're going to tell us a bit about the role of hydrogen as a vector for recovery, and would also like you to maybe explain a bit the work of Hydrogen Europe and how you see, if you can address some of these questions that Christian has just raised. Yorgo, the floor is yours. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much, Giampiero, and thanks for the opportunity to address a little bit the hydrogen issue out of the perspective of Hydrogen Europe. We are an industry association, but we also have research centers on board. So all in all, we have more than 200 members, nearly 170, and some of them are here in the call. So Alex for Fiesmann, Karl for ArcelorMittal, Cosma for SNAM. They are all members of Hydrogen Europe and very, very active members. And we are proud, but also grateful that we are about to shape a new sector. And I would like to allude a little bit to the time when I started. When I started 4 years ago, hydrogen was basically something like a science fiction niche. So something that people had in mind, they had heard about it. They were not sure whether it would come. But at the same time, we had the Paris Agreement. And I think this triggered a lot of understanding that we need globally to use technologies that help to bridge certain gaps, certain limitations of disruptive change, systemic change of the energy system. And then we worked quite hard to get the Green Deal. The Green Deal was about the idea to not exclude industry, but to include industry into the greening of the economy, into achieving the Paris Agreement. And then COVID-19 came. And I have to tell you that I don't want to be cynical, but COVID-19 was definitely, for our case, an accelerator. And I would like to explain why. We had already, as of end of last year, started to work on a plan, on a concrete plan on scaling up the capacity of producing renewable hydrogen up to 40 gigawatt in Europe and 40 gigawatt in our neighborhood, mainly Northern Africa, but also Ukraine, mainly sun-rich regions where you can produce cheaply renewable electricity and hence renewable hydrogen. Very proud to see Cosma, because I know that his company and Italy especially are working exactly on this idea to import renewable hydrogen from Northern Africa via Italy into Europe. So that plan was presented, and then COVID-19 broke out, panicking went up, and we were asked by the Commission whether we could imagine to have this 2 times 40 gigawatt deal as part of the Green Deal. Of course. And so we started to work with the Commission on a very, very concrete investment plan. What do you need to scale up the production? You need 2/3 of renewable to get 1/3 of electrolyzer, roughly. But at the same time, you need demand. You need, and you mentioned it, Giampiero, already, you cannot just think of the hen or the chicken. You need also to think of the egg. The chicken and egg problem we wanted to overcome in this plan by asking very, very clearly companies like ArcelorMittal, are you a customer? Could you be a customer? Could we produce in Northern Africa green hydrogen that we then transport via SNAM's pipelines to, let's say, an ArcelorMittal company in the south of Italy, or even more in the north? And this is the concrete plan. The concrete plan that we introduced contains an investment of 430 billion. 430 billion for the next 10 years. Also, the 2 times 40 gigawatt is for the next 10 years. And that explains already that we want to ramp up, we want to kick off, and it was accepted and received very positively, not only by the Commission, but also by other interlocutors. We then tried to not invent a new word, but basically to say what comes up is a new commodity. It's hydrogenables. It's hydrogen that comes directly from a factory, so to say, that is not going into the grid, but that is directly going to the end customer. However, I have to also to say that in order to get there, to have hydrogen in pure, dedicated backbone pipelines that we need to retrofit, they don't exist so far. We need to start to retrofit them. This needs, of course, not only investment, but needs also a plan. And we would like to start with the industrial clusters. I mentioned already steel. The low-hanging fruit is petrochemical industry, so refinery, where you have already a high amount of hydrogen that is used as a chemical feedstock, and the same applies to the chemical industry. Linking these industrial clusters via dedicated backbones will lead to a hydrogen network that we then can use. Yet, there is no clear legal basis. And we are working, of course, as Hydrogen Europe, together with members of the parliament. We heard the first vice president, but especially with the commission and with the member states, we are working on preparing this legal basis. We need a hydrogen market design. And as long as we don't have this, and to be honest, the earliest moment that this becomes gets reality would be January 24. Even if we start now the legislative process, it takes some time. What do we do in between? Here the idea is to install a steering instrument. We call it the Clean Hydrogen Alliance. And we are very happy that together with the hydrogen strategy that contains a lot of these elements that I just elaborated upon, it will be launched in the afternoon. And this Clean Hydrogen Alliance, basically consisting of, on one hand, commissioners, also national ministers and regional ministers, but especially CEOs. I'm very happy to also say to Cosma that we are very happy to welcome Marco Alverà, the CEO of SNAM, as one of the key personalities in that, I would say, club, in that instrument, to steer exactly that process, to steer the process of basically a case-by-case approach. In bringing up bigger projects, it's a case-by-case approach, where we need to apply case law, by the way, but where we need trust. We need to build up this atmosphere of trust between the policymakers and industrials. We underpinned that by a letter that was signed by 100 of our CEOs. That was quite impressive, that from Airbus to Viessmann and Vattenfall, so BP, you name them, a lot of CEOs of our sector underpinned that. And this is important because we also see that this comes from member states. Germany was already mentioned. I would say some frontrunners are countries like the Netherlands, being forced to go to something else than natural gas because they step out of natural gas due to the seismic problems they have in the north of the country. So they are quite in front technically. But look at countries like Portugal. Portugal has now announced to invest 5+2 billion into hydrogen projects. That's 7 billion in a very near future. And I think Portugal could become very soon a hydrogen giant, but the same applies also to Italy. Now, blue or green or gray or turquoise, to be honest, for us it's important that there is a low carbon content. Carbon content of hydrogen will be the new currency. And you ask, what do we need? We need the hydrogen market design that goes along with a robust system of tracing and tracking where the hydrogen comes from, certification of this process, and a clear benchmark for clean hydrogen with a quite low gram or kilogram of CO2. It depends whether you take a kilo or ton. And then we can enter into a world where we create, and I would like to finish with that, where we create a new commodity. So basically, other than electricity, hydrogen is a low and no carbon vector that can be traded globally as a new commodity. It's non-fossil like electricity, but it's tradable globally like oil and gas. And this makes the new character out of it. And we have one, not vision, one concrete wish. We want that Europe becomes the hub, becomes the central marketplace for that new commodity. We want that, like a barrel of oil is denominated in dollar, quite naturally, we want that a ton of hydrogen is quite naturally denominated in euro. And Europe has the potential. Europe will then also become an importer, but that's exactly what we need to do. We need to ramp up our own industry. We need to define where the demand is, and we need to define how much of capacity we will build up in our neighborhood and globally in order to become that global hub. Very happy to participate here and very happy to see also the active involvement of so many European companies in that endeavor that is quite exciting, new, and will help us all to reconcile economy and ecology. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Jorgo. Also been extremely good with the timing. You covered a lot of ground, and actually you addressed some of the questions that both Christian and myself have raised. I guess both in terms of the potential opportunities in the industry, but I think also you touched upon an important point I want to make immediately, which is the importance of creating these synergies across different market players. I think this is important not only to address, if you like, the industrial and technical issues, but very much also when it comes to the financial sector, having these alliances, this alignment of interest is extremely important for institutions like EBRD, but also, of course, other financial players to contribute and really create the conditions for these projects to be implemented. So this is a good point. I think you also, if I'm not mistaken, we can go back to this a bit later. I think you alluded to the need to accelerate the shift towards clean and low carbon hydrogen. So I assume that, let's say, you are supportive of the idea of moving as fast as possible into clean hydrogen rather than having too many intermediate phases. But we can go back on this later on. Thank you very much, Jorg. Again, very, very useful. So let's now, introduce, our panelists. We have an extremely high level and very, broad set of panelists today. So Alix Chambries from Vice President for Viessmann, so covering, if you like, the user side of the equation of the value chain. Carl Desmarais, ArcelorMittal. We heard from Christian some important announcement made very, very recently. Hydrogen and steel, big debate for many years. Things are moving probably faster than we could have anticipated a few years ago. So we'd like to hear also Carl's view in this respect. And of course, Cosma Panzacchi, Executive Vice President for Snam. You have been mentioned already, so I'm sure that you have a lot to say here. Covering, if I may, the supply side. And so we have really the whole value chain in our panel today. I'd like to start with Alex. I think we have a small video to play. And I would like, while leaving the floor to Alex, also to remember the role of Viessmann as many, many years of experience in this sector. I think Viessmann is one of the biggest players in the fuel cell industry. You are a significant partner in the PACE project. So you really have a lot of experience and story to share with us today. So Alex, please, the floor is yours, and I think we need to launch the small video that you proposed. Thank you.
Every home needs energy. You want to stay warm in winter and cool in summer. You like to keep the lights on when enjoying dinner with friends and family. At the end of a long working day, you unwind by cuddling up on the sofa with your tablet, reading an ebook, or watching your favorite TV show. Now you can do all this while protecting the environment and keeping your energy bills down. Fuel cell micro-cogeneration is a state-of-the-art home energy system that brings sustainable, reliable, and affordable energy to your home. With fuel cell micro-cogeneration, you can generate your own electricity while producing heating, hot water, and even cooling at the same time. In his house, Peter installed a unit which reduces his energy bill by €700 every year, saves him 2 tons of CO2 annually, and helps him to produce his own electricity for his home appliances and electric car, as well as to put the extra electricity on the grid. The EU co-funded project PACE aims to deploy more than 2,800 fuel cell units across 10 European countries in households and small businesses by 2021. Fuel cell units installed under the PACE project empower citizens to become active participants in Europe's energy transition. Surveys show that more than 90% of fuel cell owners are pleased with the environmental performance, the comfort and warmth, reliability and running costs of their unit. Fuel cells micro cogeneration is here. It works, and you can benefit from it today.
Thank you, Alex. Very interesting. And actually, while I was watching this video, immediately a question came to my mind. So how you bring hydrogen to the buildings? What are the steps you need to take? And how you see the development of this industry?
Yes, thank you. Indeed, to understand why Visma and Cogen Europe, the entire heating sector, why do we believe in hydrogen in buildings? That would be the starting point, right? And why? Because we all support the net zero emission goals for buildings, meaning the objective to achieve carbon neutrality in the building stock in 2050. And if you look at the energy system perspective, we believe that it will not be possible at the optimized cost to achieve net zero emission without green gases. We believe that there will be a high share of electrification of the building stock, probably around 50 or 60%, but there must be green gases to reduce the overall energy system cost. Why? Because the heat demand is mostly in winter. And since electricity is difficult to store, green gas has a big complementary role to play in the building stock. It can reduce backup generation costs, grid expansion costs, and fuel cells here, micro cogeneration, have a big role to play. So this is a system efficiency perspective. Another big element why we truly believe in hydrogen and green gas in general is that we also are very cautious to secure that the energy transition is people-centric. And for example, for fuel cells, we talk a lot with the end user, the homeowners, and it's very important to keep a package of options to achieve net zero goals. And for some people, they just don't want a PV on their roof, or they cannot afford to install a heat pumps because it would require huge insulation costs if they have a very old building. Or maybe they cannot simply. If you live in a multi-family apartment with no balcony, it will be very difficult to install a heat pump. So fuel cells, hydrogen-based boiler, we believe have a role to play in the future. Now, concretely, what does it mean? There will be 3 ways to use hydrogen in buildings for heating. One way is blends, so blending hydrogen into the gas grids. Up to 20-30% is no problem for the space heaters. Concretely, to be more concrete, today, without any investment on the installed heating systems, you can function without risk on safety with a 10% hydrogen blend. Now, for the new appliances, up to 30%, we believe 20-30% is possible. Then the second option is methane, to methanize hydrogen and put it as such in the grid. And the third one is pure hydrogen. And for example, in the case of fuel cells, today they function with natural gas, but the beauty of this technology is that it is fuel flexible. So if you switch to hydrogen, the efficiency will be even better. So this is why we believe a lot in that technology. And one of the questions was how to scale up the hydrogen capacity. We believe that the green gas hydrogen buildings has a big role to play as well, because it allows really to scale up and to reduce the economies of scales of hydrogen production. So we believe this is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Very interesting, and I see a lot of opportunities to create, how to say, structured value chain, also to probably address the issue of job creation, also in the context of the post-COVID responses and recovery in this space. Maybe we'll touch upon this later on, but again, a lot of interesting input that can also help defining potential business models. I would like now to turn to Carl Desmarais, Vice President, Head of Technology Strategy at ArcelorMittal Group. Carl, you have a few slides, but before giving the floor to you, I would like to also take the opportunity to let's say, reflect on the role of the steel industry in this context. You know, steel probably is one of the biggest potential market for hydrogen. So I would like to also understand, in the context of your presentation, how do you see, if you like, the role of steel more broadly in this process of market creation? Thank you, Carl. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Jean-Pierre, and thank you also indeed for the question and for the possibility to share a bit our thoughts. It's a great day today for this seminar, but also for us as Sumitomo. We just this morning announced our European carbon report, but also our ambition to be carbon neutral in 2050 and to reach already 30% reduction in 2030 in our European operations. But main contribution we wanted to give at the report is also how to achieve it. And indeed, we see an important role for hydrogen in this achievement. So a couple of slides to illustrate that. You see here a slide of the plant we are building to convert waste gas, also hydrogen-containing waste gas and carbon-containing waste gas into a bioethanol fuel, which also is an important contributor where hydrogen plays a role. But I would just quickly go through three key elements of our strategy, because it will well illustrate our thinking, but also some of the challenges. So perhaps next slide. Yeah, so I don't know if everybody's familiar with us, but we are the largest steel maker in the world. We are the #1 in all regions except in Asia, which is interesting because it gives us a different perspective. Each region has particular context of their energy landscape, and it helps us really to see what potential technology and solutions can contribute in what regional energy context. We already said it, East Europe is different than the Atlantic coast, NAFTA is different than South America. So that's one of the key advantages of ArcelorMittal, that we look really globally and we try to find technical solutions depending on the energy context we are in. And then next slide gives a bit visually, and here there's some problem with indeed the font, which is too big. But visually we of course, and that's one element in steel, that we are already quite advanced in circular economy. We recycle already all the end-of-life scrap, and that will continue to go. But that's not the solution, as there is a limited resource of scrap versus the steel demand. And we see two very important technological roadmaps that we develop in parallel, and that one is what we call rather the smart carbon way, and the other the advanced innovative DRI solution. In both technological pathways to make steel from iron ore, we want to be minus 30% in 2030, where the deliverable will mainly come from switching to natural gas, integrating carbon capture storage, integrating circular use of carbon. But we also want already 2030 to be ready with technology, how to integrate later on massive and large scale use of hydrogen in both routes in order to be carbon neutral in 2050. And just the next slide gives a bit our well-balanced view. We don't, perhaps here, I also want to be prudent on hydrogen as solution. We don't say that there is one magic solution which fits for all. We say today we use mainly carbon as an energy source, but also as a chemical reductant in our processes. And we need to switch from that fossil carbon source to clean energy sources. And we see three important drivers. One is indeed integrating carbon capture and storage in the fossil used carbon. Secondly is really focusing on reusing circular or bio-based carbon and also hydrocarbon waste as plastic into our operations. And the third one, and there hydrogen will play a key role, is in the clean electricity. How to integrate that in our high temperature processes. Well, there we need to convert electricity to hydrogen. And of course, the electrolyzer technology is for us key to follow. And we believe we need all of three, and we need to blend them. And the scalability and affordability of all of three is important, because each of one, you can look at each of one driving, and you will find challenges and constraints which are limiting the use of each of one. However, smartly combining them creates additional synergies and allows us to move ahead without locking in some limited choices for the future. So just to give a bit color on this, and I will not comment that because the report is available on our website. And next slide is just to show a bit where hydrogen plays a role. So the circular carbon, or the green part, is recover CO2 as bio-based materials, or also recycle our waste CO2 back into chemicals. In that process, hydrogen plays a role. Secondly, we can capture at the DRI and the blast furnace plant CO2 for carbon capture and storage, and we are developing and scaling this technology. When that technology is scaled and is available, it opens for us a second or a third driver, which is using indeed blue hydrogen, because the same carbon capture technology with the steam methane reforming technology can be integrated, and we can massively use this type of hydrogen in our processes, while we are also working on scaling and making the technology of the electrolyzers affordable. Because the challenge is really one, there's perhaps in contrast with Wiesmann, and I think the debate is interesting, because we have only a limited number of consumers, but they are massive. One blast furnace, one DRI unit, you need to think quickly about 1 gigawatt, 2 gigawatt, 3 gigawatt of electrolyzer needed in order to feed one unit of steel making. So the challenges, I think so. Next slide. And it brings a bit color also to your question, Giampiero, is indeed why how to accelerate, how to bring it. I think from the technology, the building blocks are there. Hydrogen is not new. Carbon capture storage is not new. This circular carbon processes are quick. Carbon capture and use are quickly evolving and coming on stream. But of course, to scale it, we need massive availability of clean energy and clean power. We need, of course, sustainable finance, because we estimate our investments for Europe around 25 to 40 billion between now and 2050. However, if you look then to the additional investments in the energy infrastructure, probably this is 5 to 10 times higher even, which will be required to feed the energy. So, and then third of all, in a global economy, we need also to think on how can we implement that in a level playing field. We are talking about Europe, and energy is difficult to export out of or import in Europe. However, steel is very easy to transport and import from other regions, and therefore this technology really needs a very profound view also on how do we create policies who ensure a level playing field for industrial consumers as steel makers.
Thank you, Carl. You have covered a lot of space, a lot of very interesting and important points that I'm sure will raise a lot of questions from our audience. I have a few questions. Maybe I'll come back to you with some specific point later. But maybe an interesting, what we're talking about, two very different sectors, buildings, residential sector, and, a commodity industry like steel, energy intensive, but, at the core of the real economy. I think both you and Alex have really, raised this point of the system thinking that, clearly to introduce these technologies, you need to look at all the elements. and create this alignment of interest across the value chain to implement this type of projects. So I'll come back to you with some questions further, Carla, but I would like now to give the floor to Cosma, because I think you are an important player in this system, right? If we talk about system thinking and how to bring the clean hydrogen to the market. So Cosma Panzacchi is Executive Vice President at SNAM. I think you have also a short video. Maybe we'll start with that and then we'll go with some questions. Thank you, Cosma.
Quality of life is closely linked to energy use. However, our development model and use of resources are no longer sustainable. We need to decarbonize the planet by focusing on renewable and clean energy. Our strategy for sustainable development includes renewable gases such as hydrogen. Hydrogen is an essential chemical element. It is the most abundant element in the universe. It can be produced from solar energy and wind power to provide clean energy for housing, transport and industry everywhere in the world. It can be easily transported and stored, also leveraging on existing infrastructure at relatively low costs. SNAM will provide both physical and intellectual networks to confront these challenges, because how we act today will shape the planet tomorrow. SNAM, energy to inspire the world.
Thanks a lot. Very, very interesting. I take a bit, how to say, moderator prerogative here, Cosma. And maybe look a bit at, EBRD, the region where we operate. We're a development financial institution operating in Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, Turkey, North Africa, Western Balkans, Central Europe as well. But just a question, because we talked a lot about Europe here and how to develop the hydrogen systems in markets where there is anyway a support, evolving but supportive policy environment, undoubtedly to be improved and to be strengthened, but there is a policy environment. There are clear market opportunities. What about other markets, like mid-income markets, emerging markets, developing markets? How do you see this kind of type of developments in let's say markets where some of these elements are not completely available, not completely present? We heard before from Yorgo this potential link with North Africa, which as EBRD we completely welcome and support. But I would like to hear from you what you think, how we can also accelerate the transformation and the hydrogen agenda in these other markets, let's say outside Europe. Thanks.
Well, Giampiero, thank you very much for your question. I think that for the sustainability of mass-scale production of hydrogen at European level, it's crucial that we also look at imports of hydrogen. And that's where I think that EBRD can be a crucial player in helping also infrastructure players like ourselves to develop local systems in emerging economies. Let me make a couple of examples here. I think that in the past, the role of EBRD has been especially effective when it came to supporting and fostering the development of renewables in some of these countries. And it's one of the key elements of facilitating in terms of sustainable finance and giving credibility also in terms of sizable projects for international investors like we are in geographies that have an inherent level of risk, which is slightly higher than the ones that we are used to. Having said that, I think that for emerging markets, there's also a huge advantage for their own economies. If we look at North Africa, I think that there's a need for hydrogen connected with fertilizers. There's a need for hydrogen connected with high temperature processes in some of their industries, but there's also a need for hydrogen to decarbonize the refining sector. So this type of discussion, I think, is an extremely interesting one, and we are indeed seeing it in our institutional discussions in North African countries, because it's a mutually beneficial development, where we can also increase progressively the level of local content. So at the beginning, probably the most interesting part or element of value add from, for example, places like Tunisia, Morocco, and the likes will be the fact that there's a huge availability of natural resources and there's an interconnection that's already there with Europe. But if we look, 5 years down the line, this could create also jobs in a very important way at local level, and put local industries also on a different competitive ground, not just based on costs, but also based on the fact that their products will have a relatively low content of CO2. And in your question, I think you also mentioned the Balkans. I think that for us, one of the other key areas of collaboration is Greece. We indeed, within the IPCI framework designed by the European Union, the Italian IPCI, which is called Green Train, and it's also connected with the Spanish IPCI, will link up with the proposals coming from Greece to create a hydrogen highway coming from Greece and entering into the Italian system. First in a blending mode, and then as we grow, it could become also a full hydrogenized network.
Thank you, Cosma. Maybe before going back to Alex, I'd like to ask maybe an extra question, because you're mentioning now the pipeline. So how ready is the system in Europe? You're talking about, of course, future development, which I assume will be designed and operated already with hydrogen in mind, but the current infrastructure in Europe, of course, was designed with a different, set of objectives and technical parameters. So how can you tell us a bit about the infrastructure in Europe? To what extent is already usable, useful, suitable for hydrogen?
Yes, I think this is also a very, very interesting topic. And I have to say, the answer depends a bit on the different countries, because it depends on how the networks were actually created over time. And for example, which type of steel had been used in the different networks. So what I can comment on, for example, is that our pipelines are 70% of our network today is already hydrogen ready, full hydrogen ready, and we are upgrading the rest of our infrastructure. We have seen some numbers coming out from the organization of German TSOs, which is also very high in terms of percentages. One of the key issues there are two key issues I think that will need to be solved as we go forward. The first one regards storage at mass scale. So that's an area that will need to be addressed. And one of the key points about this on top of technology will also be how the different national systems will play together, because salt domes, for example, are not available in all countries across Europe. And the second issue regards the distribution of gas, where I think that also player like Weissmann will come into the discussion. And the distribution of gas, it's at this point in time slightly more complicated, in the sense that it's much more heterogeneous, and therefore even within a country like Italy, but Germany too, you will have very different upgrades that you will need to roll out in the different contexts. What I can say, however, is that the analysis that we have conducted also with our peers, and SNAM is leading a technical group of the largest European TSOs on this, is that the amount of capex that will be needed to upgrade or repurpose our networks is very, very limited. We are talking about percentage points, not huge sums.
Thank you, Cosma. This is very, very interesting, and it shows that the current situation can certainly support an accelerated uptake of the hydrogen market. Thank you. Actually, maybe kind of remaining on this point of the markets, I think we still have a few minutes for a second round of questions before opening the floor to questions from the audience. So, Alex, you mentioned, the opportunity, but to an extent also, if you like, the complexity to get to the point where, the market picks up and indeed there is an acceleration. Can you maybe elaborate a bit on what you see as the policy enablers that can allow companies like Viessmann to really provide, if you like, the business solutions to deliver, if you like, hydrogen devices, equipment at scale in the building sector particularly, and I assume also to maybe look into other business models that can indeed accelerate this process. Thank you.
Yes, yes. So indeed, for new business model, the policy drivers are really critical for us. And I would say that the number one opportunity is to accelerate the modernization of heating system via incentive programs, policy support. This is no regrets, because the vast majority of heating system is extremely inefficient. So we are really in a situation where CO2 emissions are locked in our building stock. So number one priority is simply to modernize this system. The second priority is to synchronize this modernization, the space heater roadmap, with the green gas roadmap. And Cosma Panchasi mentioned that the cost of the transformation of gas grid is marginal for hydrogen, if I understood correctly. For space heaters, it's a little bit the same, in the sense that the more you anticipate, the lower the cost. It's as simple as that. And there, the policy framework can help indeed. So as I said today, without further investment, we can already digest 10% of hydrogen blends into the grid. And now if we would like to ramp up blends into the gas grids, that's where you need to anticipate the changes. And why is anticipation so paramount? It is because on average, a space heater will stay 25 years on the market. Meaning that if you buy a space heater, a fuel cell or a boiler in 2025, it will be still in the buildings in 2050. Where in 2050, if we all succeed, and I'm sure we will see a much higher share and role of hydrogen in the grid. So this is why, even though hydrogen today is still at the beginning of the upscaling phase, we must anticipate already today in legislation the rules for space heaters. And here Viessmann, together with the heating industry, we are providing proposal to the European Commission within the eco-design and energy labeling framework, which sets the rules, the requirements for space heaters. And one example is to require that all space heaters placed on the market from 2025 onwards, approximately, for example, are able to digest up to 20 or 30% hydrogen. That would be an option that can be achieved at almost zero cost for the end user. We just need to have enough time in advance to adapt our technologies, and at close to zero cost. So this is a no regret. Then another very important change is to adapt the building codes to create business models. And here I want to mention the change of the law in Germany for buildings, which I believe is very interesting. Last week, they changed the law to allow the end user, the homeowners, to meet the primary energy performance requirements in new build and major renovation via green gases. So it means that if I am a homeowner or building owner, I now thanks to that change, I have the choice between either PV on the roof or a heat pump or more insulation. Either I can meet the same requirements with green gases. And this opens completely new business opportunities, of course. And provide flexibility. So we believe this is something that needs to be adopted across EU member states. Now, for the business models, to come back to fuel cells, we have made some studies together with Cogeneration Europe, which show that the competitiveness of hydrogen space heating technology will depend on the hydrogen price. That's where there is a lot of win-win opportunities of synergies across the value chain. And for example, in this study, which is not yet public, but it will be public soon, it shows that with a production cost of hydrogen below 80 euro per megawatt hour, we can, fuel cells will be competitive compared to other conventional technologies. So that's where really we are dependent on the whole value chain for the competitiveness of our new technologies. Now we are ready to invest in innovation. And the last comment, it's about the new business model. We believe a lot in a mindset shift, in the sense that we create a startup called Wismar Wärme, which aims at selling not a product or technology, but selling comfort. And this is in the circular economy mindset, allowing people not to spend money upfront, but to have a contract where simply they buy heat and comfort every month at a much smaller price. And we think that this new innovative business model, along with digitalization offering, can be a big driver to facilitate the modernization and greening of space heating.
Thanks a lot, Alex. A lot of material, a lot of inputs. I hope also colleagues from the European Commission are taking notes about your suggestion. I'd like to go back to. So go ahead. Sorry.
I see I have a few minutes left. Another big important element is demand side management. The more we move in green gases and sector coupling, the more demand side management will be interesting. And there the policy framework can support as well as new business model. And the beauty of fuel cells or hybrid solutions is that they can choose which fuel to use depending on whether there is abundance of electricity or not. And do peak load shaving, demand side management. There are big opportunities there as well.
Thanks a lot. Absolutely. Thank you. I'd like to go back to Carl, because, again, I'd like to congratulate again for this announcement to ArcelorMittal. I think gives a very, very important signal, I would say, not only to the steel industry, but I guess to the whole, let's say, what people call hard to abate sector, because it gives a message, I think, of the possibility to do it, and within the timeline that, let's say, are required or needed to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement in general, the maintaining temperature increase within reasonable limits. A question for you, Carl, because I think you gave a very interesting perspective, and you are an expert of technologies, and you mentioned the need really to balance the approach and to take into consideration the right technologies, and to an extent making sure that, let's say, there is no bias in that respect, but you apply the right solutions to the right plants. But I have a very critical question, because your sector, like others, is characterized by long investment cycles. It's not, it's easy to talk about decarbonization, but at the same time, we're talking about assets that last for decades, that take a while to be amortized. So making new investments in a relatively limited timeline is complex and difficult from many perspectives, industrial perspective, financial perspective. So how do you see, this kind of a complex situation, or probably in certain cases accelerating certain investments? So how do you see this, if you like, tension between doing the right steps to decarbonize the industry and taking into consideration the long-term investment cycle of your industry, but others in the energy-intensive sectors? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question indeed, because you said it also. 2050 is far away, and 2050 is tomorrow already. It's only 30 years away when we decide on on refurbishment of one of our key installations, a blast furnace or a DRI plant. We normally have a life of 25, 30 years that we create with that modernized new asset. So indeed, everything decision we take today will impact already our technology up to 2050 nearly. And therefore, we really bought the document today, and I would invite everybody to carefully study and read it and come back to us and also challenge us. But what we don't believe is a magic solution overnight. Suddenly, the 1.5 billion tons of steelmaking capacity of today is disappeared, and overnight, suddenly there comes a magic new solution out of the sky. That will never happen. Secondly, metallurgically, and I think technology can be very, very complex, but technology can also be extremely simple. That means if you look to what we do, we take iron ore, which is iron and oxygen. It's just oxidized iron, and we reduce that. And there is no magic solution. In physics, you can only do that at large scale with high temperature gas, reduction gas, which is or carbon monoxide or hydrogen. That are the only options. That are the two options that we already use today in the blast furnace and in the DRI plants of today. Those reductions are made of those two reduction gases at high temperature. So in fact, there is no real need to change the heart of the process. What is needed is to change how we look to hydrogen or electricity and to carbon, because the byproducts of that process are also what we call waste gases, and those waste gases are today just burned for energy purposes. So our philosophy is, let's look at the DRI plant and let's look at our blast furnace plant. Let's just recover all the waste gases, and like in chemistry, you use it as a stock feed for doing something else, but stop incinerating waste gas and use renewable energy instead. And I think that has opened a totally new perspective, a perspective that our existing asset value in DRI and in blast furnace has a new life. We have now the technology and the know-how to really talk about advanced, modernized iron making, one hand. Secondly, we also have the technology in hand to gradually and flexibly mix and switch more and more the fossil carbon inputs only to alternative inputs, as I mentioned. And the alternative inputs can be bio-based carbon, can be plastic waste, which is otherwise incinerated, which is containing mainly carbon and hydrogen, can also be electricity that we use directly or that we use indirectly as hydrogen. And of course, I think that's an important element also in the transition. I said it already, the scalability and affordability is the biggest problem to start moving. If you only mention hydrogen or waste as an alternative for the fossil source, you will hard to move it on a significant scale, because that requires the buildup of a very large infrastructure and supply chain to bring those alternative hydrogen and carbon sources to our plants. And there I really see the carbon capture and storage as a mandatory technology to intermediately already capture the carbon, convert it into a transportable carbon dioxide, so it can be liquid or it can be gases. The advantage of carbon dioxide is that it's quite cheap to transport, and that existing transport infrastructure like ships is nearly available, and it's already done worldwide, shipping liquid CO2 over long distances. So I see that as a very important starting point, which also will help a more renewable economy or a new renewable power sector and a hydrogen sector, is to already kickstart with a carbon capture and storage technology, which will create not only a hydrogen infrastructure, but for me also a carbon and a CO2 infrastructure. And I think Cosma, but also Jorge mentioned the import of hydrogen. Let's don't be too quickly here. Transport hydrogen over long distances is costly. It is a difficult molecule to transport and to pressurize and to liquefy. However, indeed, if you can take CO2 and you have hydrogen, you can create methane or you can create methanol, ethanol out of those two molecules, and then you can have a liquid hydrocarbon, which is indeed extremely easy to transport, which is already done today. Methanol, ethanol transport and infrastructure is there. So I would really open the perspective. If you talk about hydrogen, don't think too narrow. You need to look at the total impact. You need to include liquid fuel, liquid molecules, because not everything can be done with gas. And I'm a bit nuanced in that. I always want to give a balanced view and not surf only on create a hype. I think we need to very seriously and have to work very hard on it. And in ArcelorMittal, our strategy is based on our existing asset value, has still the potential to become carbon neutral. We have developed the building blocks. We are now working very hard on the large-scale demonstrators. And the next step indeed will be, once the policy framework is in place, also to scale up, to roll out, and to gradually, project by project, bring our emissions down from today -30 in 2030, and then continuing on that pathway to net zero in 2050.
Thanks a lot, Carl. Very, very interesting and very useful. A lot of inputs, a lot of material. We are running slightly behind time, and I would like really to give space for colleagues in Genco, but maybe a last question to Cosma. Actually, we received a lot of questions from the audience, so I'd like maybe to combine 2 or 3 of them and see and challenge Cosma on this question. I think, again, thank you for all the participants for the really huge amount of questions, but let me try to combine 2 or 3 of them for Cosma to address. I think one question was about the amount of investments. You know, Jorgo mentioned some figures in his contribution. It would be interesting, you know, to hear your analysis, Cosma and Znam, what it takes to, you know, bring hydrogen to Europe. You know, what is the order of magnitude we're talking about? Combined to that, you're already elaborating on the role of North Africa. Maybe it would be interesting to hear briefly from you. We have like 3 minutes. You know, how far you can go. You know, can you build pipelines to connect the Middle East? You know, is it something? And finally, maybe like a yes/no, is possible the decarbonization, you know, achievement of the Paris alignment goals without hydrogen? So that's a yes/no question based on your on your kind of analysis.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Giampiero. Starting from the first question, I think that when Jorgo was talking about hundreds of billions of euros, of course, he was talking about kickstarting the entire value chain of hydrogen, so including all the final applications. So the number can be pretty sizable because we're talking about revolutionizing over a period of time an entire and large sector of the economy. The numbers that we have in mind instead, in terms of you know, bringing hydrogen from Northern Africa to Italy and Europe, are relatively limited, relatively small. In concrete terms, we, according to our calculations and including the cost of infrastructure, you can have hydrogen delivered in Italy at a cost that is below 2 euros per kilo. Okay, so that gives you an idea. You can reverse engineer that, but it can give you an idea of the cost of the infrastructure. In terms of full decarbonization, is it possible without hydrogen? I think the question should be changed. Is it possible and efficient without hydrogen? And the answer is no.
Thank you. Very rapid. Maybe before giving the floor to Paul and Rory, Carl, what do you think? You agree with Cosma on his analysis of you know, decarbonization with or without hydrogen?
Yeah, it's a key factor in this. We will need it. We need it also with other technologies that I mentioned already. It's not. It will never deliver. You will not deliver it with only hydrogen. but without hydrogen, it will also be hard or difficult to deliver. So it's one of the building blocks that we need to install in it. And the challenge will be scale and cost for some sectors. Right? So you see, I see a different perspective in the large scale, the small scale, the distributed, or the central consumption. Jean-Pierre, that's all different. I think it will play a role, definitely. Without hydrogen, difficult, but with only hydrogen, we will also not achieve it.
Okay. Alex, 10 seconds. Yes, no? Can you do transition without hydrogen? You're on mute, Alex.
I think we can do everything. It's a question of costs and how much we are willing to pay. So the question is how to best the cheapest way to achieve our goal. And yes, with hydrogen and green gas, biomethane has a big role to play as well, or synthetic methane. Green gases, including hydrogen, have a big impact on on reducing the whole energy transition costs.
Very, very good. So, Alex, Carl, Cosma, many thanks for your extremely interesting contribution. Again, we're running a bit out of time, so I would immediately pass the floor to Paul McCormack and Rory Monaghan from GENCO, which is a very innovative initiative, Europe-wide initiative to deliver smart hydrogen. So, Paul, Rory, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Gianpiero, thank you very much indeed. We have another video from Mairead McGuinness, the MEP, the Vice President, if that's able to be run.
I want to say a word too about the GenCom, Generating Energy Secure Communities through Smart Renewable Hydrogen. And I think this is a really important initiative because it will increase public awareness about the role of hydrogen. And I think from the country I come from, Ireland, it's really good that 2 of our island communities are part of this big, if you like, package, part of this drive towards climate neutrality. So I'll give a shout out to Valentia and Rathlin Islands.
There's a small animation we can run now which gives you the bird's eye view of the entire project, please. That animation gives you a very quick overview of the GenCom project. Our next number of slides will go through the project and give you the detail of not where we've come from, but where we're heading to and where we want to go. A number of years ago, there was a group of us got together and to give us a title, probably Renewable Energy Mavericks. Mark Welch from Nigeria, Bodo Gross from EUSEW, Rory Monaghan from Galway, and myself, Lionel Estelle, and Isabelle Poulea from INSA in France. And they say necessity is the mother of invention. We looked at how we could unlock the gridlock in the energy network, how an island off the west coast of Europe could gain energy security and develop that energy security for all of Europe. And that's where the GenCom project came from. Next slide, please. The GenCom project covers 10 partners across 5 countries. It's 9.3 million. It's funded through Interreg Northwest Europe. They shared our vision 6 years ago. When I said we were energy mavericks, we now find ourselves 6 years later being able to be mainstream, ahead of the curve, and making sure that Europe is ahead of the renewable energy curve, using hydrogen as an energy vector. If we can click through the slide, please, it's animations. We're looking in Northern Ireland, the wind farm, which is now going to produce the renewable hydrogen, the green hydrogen, what we call hydrogen renewables, but also smart hydrogen, powering buses for use in Belfast and trials. Go ahead, please. Looking at Scotland, the plant already up and operational, the closed circle, they're using the hydrogen from the waste plants and powering the fish processing fuel and powering diesel refuse trucks. Next one, please. And in Germany, under EUSEW and Bodo Gross and Wilhelm Clements, looking at how we use solar to produce hydrogen to power cars. Go ahead. So we're looking at how we use hydrogen as an energy vector, how we're going to use it to propel and fuel Europe's energy transition, not just fuel in the traditional sense of the word, but through research, through pilots, through demonstrations, and through data-informed decision-making, how we change the energy equation in Europe. How instead of becoming net importers, we could in the future become net exporters. How at the end of the supply chain, we now become the start of the supply chain. And those energy communities become energy secure by using the renewables and developing further renewables onshore and offshore, bringing in bio, hydrogen, solar to increase that renewables and increase that green energy footprint. Next slide, please. So using our smart H2, green energy, and that transition to green energy, and as Alex said, there will be other fuels within that transition, the biomethane and other green gases. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, as Carl de Meer said. It's going to be a hybrid. And that's the big challenge for Europe moving forward. That transition from a one-stop fossil fuel to a different hybrid solution for our energy needs in mobility, in heat, in our houses, in transitioning. How then we're able to use that smart hydrogen decision support tool so that the business community and our associate partners can now look at using data to make informed decisions. How, with our partnerships with Ian Williamson and the European Hydrogen Association, do we spread our message across Europe? So it's not just industry, it's community as well, taking charge of their own security and looking forward. Go ahead, please. How smart H2 from renewable energy is fueling Europe's energy revolution. It's not going to happen overnight. It will take time, but we can transition to that. And how do we decouple our fossil fuel energy network? How do we now take this chance presented on the back end of a crisis? How we take the opportunity to decouple that energy network and revolutionize the old networks that are there and use the new grids. And all of the partners on the call here have all different solutions that all fit into that new energy jigsaw for Europe. Next slide, please. A picture paints 1,000 words. Within our Hazel project, which is moving beyond GenCom and the other work that we're doing, hydrogen-enabled zero-emission supply chains, working with Macadi, Energia, Bosch, Gas Networks Ireland, RISE, Mabus, and Zentgraf. How we use the energy opportunity now from our renewables, bypass the gridlock that we currently have to fully enable renewables onshore and offshore, fully enable renewables that we can bring in onto the grid to meet our needs in transport, meet our needs in consumption, in heat, and in industries, the biggest footprint there. But on the back end of this, as Mr. McGuinness said, 75% of the greenhouse gases in Europe come from our energy. How do we tackle that? By being smart, by being innovative. And the important bit also is, how do we then at the back end use this as a strong stimulus to boost growth, economic growth, and boost jobs? How do we now kickstart the European economy by being smart, by greening the economy? And that picture paints that whole closed circle within Europe. If we're able to transition to that, it'll not happen overnight. By 2030 and 2050, yes, there will be different targets, there will be different opportunities there. But how do we start now with our project, with the partners here in Energy Week, and get what we call energy literacy into the equation, where people understand the opportunities and understand the challenges coming forward and aren't afraid of the challenges? How do we now then step that forward? And how do we combine, roll out our technologies and make smart H2 that energy factor that can tilt the balance in Europe in our favour for CO2 emission reductions, for job increases, and for a new economy? I'd like to pass over now to my colleague, Dr. Roy Monaghan from University in Galway.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. If we go to the next slide, I will just give a brief explanation of what the main output of the GenCom project is, which is the decision support tool. So it's been recognized in this panel and in others that hydrogen can give benefits to industry and to policymakers. But how can we get people on the ground, the actual decision makers who decide on investments, to understand the benefit of hydrogen? So we've got this chicken and egg situation where someone who wants to be a supplier of hydrogen may not know who the demanders of hydrogen are, and vice versa. Can we go forward, please? So this is where the Community Hydrogen Forum comes in, which is the main output of the GenCom project. One more slide, please. And again, forward. So the Community Hydrogen Forum operates the decision support tool, which I'll describe in a moment. And the decision support tool is really to provide the missing information between potential suppliers and potential users of hydrogen. We're situated in Northwest Europe, as we are a project funded by Interreg Northwest Europe. So I'm going to show you some case studies from our decision support tool that goes from the very local, where I am here on the west coast of Ireland, to the national for Ireland, and to the multinational for Northwest Europe. Forward again, please. And one more again. Thank you. So the objectives of this hydrogen forum are to raise awareness for the potential of hydrogen, to share the information that we can generate with as many stakeholders as possible, to keep up to date. One thing that's become clear over the last year or so in hydrogen is that this is such a fast changing environment. So we need to keep up to date. We'll discuss what the decision support tool is to link up suppliers and potential users, and to address really what Christian said in the first talk in this panel, which is how do we future-proof the supply lines, the supply chains of renewable hydrogen. And there's our website at the bottom that you can check us out. One more, please. So the decision support tool, if you just go through this slide, maybe go forward a few more, we'll just see that what we do in the decision support tool, this is an engineering-based tool where we assess what potential demands there are for hydrogen, what the potential supplies for hydrogen are. For the work that we've done so far, we've looked at wind, we've looked at 2 potential sources of wind, curtailed wind and dedicated wind supply. And we have an algorithm that optimizes electrolyzer size for any given wind farm in Northwest Europe. So we'll just look very briefly, and I'm not going to keep you long, very briefly on some of our results. So if we go forward one more, please. So our first case study is the local. This is my town of Galway in the west of Ireland. We host Ireland's largest wind farm, 174 megawatts. And our question here is, can we use the curtailed energy from this wind farm, and there's quite a substantial amount because it's in a very weak grid area, to run buses in our local city. Going forward one more, we can see some of the results that we've been calculating levelized costs of hydrogen. These are calculations that are done within industry across Europe, but this is really trying to express it in a way that can break down the barriers between sectors. And we can see that for Ireland, with our very favorable wind regime, we can produce bus operational costs costs that are near, not quite near, what diesel operation costs are. Going forward one more, we can see some sample results for a national-based system. This is when we looked at Ireland as a whole, looked at holistically at the public bus networks within the largest towns and cities in Ireland. And we ran optimization to find where we could produce our hydrogen, how cheaply we could get it to our end users. And we can see that we're coming in at lower predicted costs in the future. And this is comparative with diesel costs. So as we go forward to the next slide, I'll finish on this slide here. And this is really showing our results when we put this in a pan-European context. And this is looking at the Northwest Europe region. If you go to this website, you'd be asked to create a free account. You can see for your nearest large city where the hydrogen can be sourced, and you can see measures in a way that's easily communicable to the public how much that hydrogen can cost and what the potential is for hydrogen in your area. So I'm short on time. I leave it there and pass it back over to our moderator. Thank you.
Rory, Paul, many thanks. Very interesting, and indeed will be interesting to spend a bit more time. But I think we are running a bit out of time here. I would like to thank all of you, Yorgo, Christian, Alex, Cosma, Carl, Paul, Rory, for your interventions. I would like to remind the audience that we'll try to answer the questions on social media, EBRD, GenCom, and Cogen Europe. And I'd like to pass the floor to Stefania Raccolta from the EBRD to provide the closing remarks and close this section. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Giampiero. I will try to summarize very quickly what we have heard today. Building up hydrogen economy and harnessing the opportunities associated with this economy requires a full supply chain approach. It requires investments in production, in infrastructure, and it also requires creating the market demand. We have heard today from our panelists that a supportive policy framework is absolutely crucial, that there is a need to create this trust between the policy makers and the investors to give industry and the investors the clarity and the long-term certainty. And while we know that technological developments are progressing very fast, the clean hydrogen is not yet fully cost competitive. So in this meanwhile, we will need to work with, let's say, a concessional co-financing blended with commercial co-financing to bridge the gap until it becomes fully cost competitive. And this opens up a strong investment agenda for member states, but also for countries beyond the EU. I'm talking about Neighborhood East, Neighborhood South, also accession countries, the Western Balkans. And we see a lot of opportunities in our region. EBRD stands ready to support the European Green Deal objectives and the EU's ambition to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. And we would be leveraging our balance sheet. We would bring in our track record, our business model, our financial instruments, and we will be working in partnerships with the European Commission and Global Climate Fund and industry associations to bring to the market the necessary financing, to conduct the right policy dialogue activities, to create an enabling framework for investments. I would like to leave you with one thought, because this is something that has been discussed by a few of our panelists, and this is basically the great dream that North Africa and the potential for solar PV can bring to power green hydrogen production. And
I want to leave you with one thought. Basically, we worked out that only 1% of the land surface in the southeastern Mediterranean region could accommodate all the solar PV capacity needed to meet the clean hydrogen demand for that region and the EU. And I'm talking about the demand by 2050. So it can be done. Everybody is preparing and working in the right direction. EBRD will be there for our clients and for our countries of operation. And I would like to thank once again the organizers, the panelists, our excellent support that we had from let's say the facilitators and the technical staff that has made this virtual event a success. Thank you very much to everybody.